Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams in collaboration with the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum on the occasion of the World Environment Day. Thank you for joining us from the millions of other programs happening today. Today's session is There is No Planet B, Lessons from the Pandemic for Climate Justice. Joining us are Navroz Dubash, Chandrabhushan, Tejal Kantikar, and moderating the discussion is Abhiraj Nayak. Before I hand over to Mansi from the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum, just a few instructions. For those of you who are here for the first time, do sign up to our mailing list if you are not on it already. You can do that by visiting our website or follow us on our social media channels. You can also listen to our podcast today that we released today on Rewilding Cities by Harini Nagendra. So for those of you who are here in the room, you can look at the chat box. We will share the bios of today's panelists via the chat box. Next to the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen, is the Q&A section. You can post your questions in the Q&A section. For those of you who are watching this session on YouTube, you can post your comments on the comment section and we will ensure that it is asked in the room. With that, over to you, Mansi.
Thank you, Raghu. So for everybody who doesn't know of the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum, we are an inter-institutional initiative looking to encourage dialogues and discussions around issues of sustainability in urban and peri-urban areas with a focus on Bangalore. I'm sure all of us are really looking forward to a very engaging session. So I will invite Abhiraj Nayak to start. He is a person who wears many hats. He's an activist academic, he's a community builder and design hacker for transformative change. And without further ado, Abhiraj, could you please take on?
Thanks very much, Mansi. I'll also welcome my panelists to turn their videos on and be with us. So firstly, let me start off with taking permission from everyone who's joined us today to speak and also convey my wishes for World Environment Day. I think I also want to welcome each and every person who's here, whatever your identity, however you think of your politics, whatever energy and forces you bring with you, you are all welcome. I'd encourage you to be fully present with us through this very important discussion. So if, like me, you're carrying some tension with you through the day, now's a good moment to reconnect with your body, that which gets you through life. Maybe even take in a deep breath and give yourself some care and attention. And let's get straight to the heart of our discussion today, which is rather provocatively titled, There is No Planet B, Lessons from the Pandemic for Climate Justice. So I'm as keen as all of you to actually listen to our stellar panel today. And what I'm going to get us started with is my sense of the word or the term climate justice. And as a student and as a researcher of climate justice, I'm excited because unlike many other discussions, the focus of our discussion today is emergent. There is no 100% clarity on this is what climate justice is. And if we think about justice itself, with 2,500 plus years of intellectual debate, discussion, planning, contestation, we still continue to look for effective definitions and effective realizations. So my own sense of climate justice, and I must say that I come from a very located context and I'm rather strident with my own politics. My own sense of climate justice is like environmental justice and like environmental justice movements that preceded the wave of climate action that we are seeing today. Most discussions come down to some kind of disputation over how benefits and burdens are distributed, right? Going back to the presence of toxic pollution in low-income, vulnerable, and African American or immigrant communities in the US, to the experience of indigenous people in South America, to the experience of Adivasis and the urban poor in India, there is usually a recognition that for some reason, the burdens of developmental activity, if you wish, are disproportionately faced by particular vulnerable, impoverished, and oftentimes different sets of people. The second element I'd like to add as a part of my own sense of climate justice is it's not really a new discussion in that sense, right? A historical investigation would connect it to the experience of colonialism, would connect it to a particular rise of rapacious predatory neoliberal capitalism, and would connect it to histories and cosmologies, if you wish, of indigenous communities from across the world. Third, and my penultimate point here, is flowing from this initial recognition of something being awry with how benefits and burdens are distributed. There is an effort to realign our own relationship with the environment, right? And this is the reason why environmental justice and climate justice conversations are wonderful mixed spaces. You'll have your New World spiritual nutcase hanging out with your hardcore environmental activist, hanging out with your very respectable UNFCCC policy advisor, right? And everybody in that sense is interested in how does one rethink or reframe our relationship with nature, right? And my final point here would be, for me, environmental justice usually comes back to what communities do, what communities can do, what communities have the space to do, right? And in the context of this wonderful event organized by the Bangalore International Center and the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum, I'm keen to think about what might the communities of Bangalore do in the context of climate justice itself. So that's it for me by way of a very, very capacious and wide framing. I would invite each of my co-panelists to define and redefine climate justice multiple times over this conversation. And I'll maybe first invite Tejal to comment on what she thinks of climate justice and why is it important for us to be talking about this today.
Yeah, thanks, Abhairaj. I wasn't expecting to go first, but let me make a few points very quickly. I think there are multiple ways in which the current pandemic, and I think it's important that we make the connection right up front. There are ways in which the current pandemic is sought to be connected to the looming climate crisis, from the prevalence of zoonotic diseases, the role of various transmission vectors, if you will, to the fact that the nature of both the current health crisis as well as the upcoming, the ongoing also environmental and climate crisis is going to be global. Or even the economic impacts of both kinds of crises, right? Are there similarities that we see across? It's not possible for me to sort of address the whole range of these different parallels, and I'm not qualified to do so either. But for me, I think the biggest lesson from this pandemic is how our experience of it underlines the need for equity and justice as the basic pillars on which we should think about environmental action. If I think in the environmental movement and even internationally, this has been a part of the narrative. It might not necessarily always have been part of what was finally accepted as policy, but it has definitely played a role in the narrative. But we need to strengthen our demands and articulations of climate justice. But unfortunately, what happens is while both these things, equity and justice, get paid the usual lip service, their concrete operationalization and the upfront prioritization of the rights of the working classes, be it the industrial workers or the peasantry, do not find more than a cursory mention in most proposals. And so in terms of operationalization, a lot of this gets relegated to vague slogans at best. So I want to just outline a few arguments that have been making the rounds in the context of COVID-19 and climate change recently. And the first has been, it's this sort of positive side effect of the lockdown, which is basically the environmental benefits, right? There have been a lot of articles that have been written about how we have lesser emissions, lesser pollutants, and so on, and that this constitutes some kind of learning, some lessons that we could take from how we go forward. Well, there is no doubt that there has been a reduction. I think we have estimates now, and there's a paper in Nature recently that says that there's been about a 17% reduction in 2020, in April 2020, as compared to 2019. And this is basically, most of it comes from the aviation sector, followed by surface transport and industry. But what it shows is that even with a dramatic halt in economic activity, the kind that we've seen in the last couple of months, our daily emissions have reduced by a maximum of only 17%. That means 83% of the emissions will still continue to take place. And so this sort of puts into question the kind of, there is a lot of literature in climate change that now focuses on behavioral economics, from the Nobel Prize winning, Nobel laureates of in economics of 2 years ago to the more recent winners. This has been a major aspect of economics that has been rewarded. And this is there in the climate change literature as well, that we should, we have our current experience shows that we should actually have practices such as work from home, for example, which can be both win-win economically as well as environmentally are win-win things. It entails minimized commutes for employees, an attendant reduction in transport emissions, reduced rental outlays, and so on and so forth. But what this does not take into account is the fact that even if we exclude, let's say, cultivators and agricultural workers, it just addresses maybe a very, very small, a minuscule fraction of the total workforce. And, even, so for example, the entire manufacturing sector and a large chunk of manufacturing in Indian cities. I think one thing that the pandemic has brought forth is the workers, especially the workers in the manufacturing units of the cities of this country, which were relegated to the margins of the city, and therefore maybe also to the margins of middle class consciousness. I think given that they were forced into our view so horribly in the last few months, I think has forced us to acknowledge that cities are places where we produce things, and these things cannot be produced from home. And so they don't apply here. You also have a large chunk of our workforce, even in the services sector, for example, hospitality or banking or social work or education, which corresponds to 7% of our workforce. They require physical presence in the workplace. And what does this mean? So right now we have also to think about this, I think, in the context of a lot of arguments that have been made about online education, right? And the fact that we have an NFHS survey that tells us that 47% of our population don't even live in pakka houses. And this doesn't even include the urban poor necessarily, a lot of whom stay in extremely small houses and chawls and, working class housing is very different as compared to our electricity consumption is low. Only 25% of our population has access to the internet. This is including access through smartphones. So what it tells us is that our demand, before we talk about changing the nature of work and our workplaces, our demand should be adequate and affordable conditions of housing and basic amenities for all. I think this has been shown quite clearly in our experience of the pandemic. And this, when we articulate concrete demands for climate justice in the future, I think this is what we should be talking about. I think in international fora, when developing countries have made the argument about equity, I think there has been some understanding of this, the fact that we are a deficit in this kind of infrastructure that is needed for a large majority of our people. There's an acknowledgement of it. Whether we actually then do something about it domestically or not is a different question. I mean, and I'm quite willing to admit that we don't do it. But there has been this understanding as part of our narrative in the international forum. And I think this is also, I mean, there are two more things that I would quickly like to touch upon before I hand over this back to you, is that in the same way, and as behavioral changes, there have also been a lot of proposals for what are known as green fiscal packages that try and that talk about putting conditionalities on manufacturing or industry uh, when they access, let's say, the fiscal stimulus that governments might provide. Now, this is fine for maybe developed countries, but in India, the conditions of production are such that a large chunk, like I mentioned before, of our production, even in the large manufacturing sector, depends on the unorganized sector. So a big car manufacturer depends for nuts, bolts, batteries, plates, brakes, gears on the small and medium enterprises. And so even though you might have a final sustainable product that is delivered by the car manufacturer in the end, the cost of delivering that product is a change in the way in which production systems are structured across the supply chain. So we have to make sure, even when we don't have a crisis, making this transition is difficult. In times of one of the most severe crises that we are facing in the country and all over the world, to ask, especially such unorganized segments of the supply chain to undertake changes, I think will be extremely difficult and also unfair. And the last point that I want to make before I close is that there is another, and you've also mentioned it, Abhairaj, in your opening statement, as well as our communication earlier, are the arguments for degrowth and deindustrialization. This is sort of, in my opinion, a romanticized sort of view of some idyllic past, and also a romanticized view of traditional knowledge. And I think the simplistic skepticism regarding industrialization ignores the fact that the world's capacity to respond to a health or an environmental crisis depends on scientific and technological advances, and not to appeals to the benevolence of Mother Nature, for example. And so such advances are connected to also our productive economic and industrial activities. In fact, I mean, so we look towards a vaccine being developed, or our capacity to produce ventilators rapidly, right? We don't, even in this health crisis. And similarly, the world's capacities to improve the environment, to address the danger of climate change, also are dependent on scientific development. You take process waste recovery or enhancing energy efficiency or recycling techniques, for example, have developed because of industrial activity and not in spite of it. So this argument against industrialization, I think also, in my opinion, trivializes the hardship, the drudgery and exploitation that are vestiges of a pre-industrial era. The limited scientific advances of the past killed many more people of far less deadlier infectious diseases than they do now. And it's unfortunate that we as a country remain industrially and technologically backward. And so this kind of drudgery continues for many of our fellow Indians. I think that's the most important lesson for me from the pandemic, is that when we talk about going forward, it's quite clear now that an underdeveloped and unequal society is very likely to respond to a crisis by sacrificing its poorest populations. So building infrastructure, housing, public healthcare systems, and reducing the precarity of work should be our foremost priority as we go forward. This will be the first and the durable line and a durable line of defense against the impending climate crisis. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. So Tejal, so many rich points there to explore, and I'm certainly going to return to them. Thank you very much for getting us thinking both about the concrete and about this sort of particular context of India at this point in history. I'd just like to also announce that a detailed description of Tejal's many accomplishments is in your chat box, and please do send us questions and comments using the Q&A function. We certainly want this panel to engage with all of you in the limited time we have. So now let me please invite Chandra to respond to the questions that get us started off. What do you think is important to talk about and think about in the context of climate justice? And like Tejal, if you're feeling ready to jump into the climate COVID nexus, if I may, you're welcome to bring that in as well. Chandra, you'll have to, I think you're still on mute, so you'll just have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So I thank you first for moderating the panel and the organization for inviting me here, Bengaluru Sustainability Forum. But let me start by saying that people are doing wrong comparison between COVID and climate change. Okay, I think there is a sense in activists that COVID is an opportunity to push the agenda of climate change, and I think they are getting it wrong. And I say that because if you look at climatic impacts, the impacts of climate change, you have extreme weather event or short-term impact, extreme short-term impact. And then you have long-drawn impact, which which will happen over a longer period of time. Now, COVID is acute, and that we need to understand. Acute and global in nature. And so far, climate change impact has been extreme and local in nature. So I think we need to differentiate the kind of impact that climate change is going to have going ahead probably in next 1 or 2 decades, and the kind of impact a pandemic has. So one, I think most of the environmentalists and scientists working on climate change are doing wrong comparison. Now, a COVID-like impact, which is acute and global, will happen in climate change if we have a sudden disruption in climatic system. For example, if monsoon stops, okay? That kind of global impact where it will be felt across the world. So the extreme of climate impact would be something that we are experiencing now in COVID in terms of economic shutdown, okay? Or for example, disruption in lives of people. Now, why I'm saying this is because if we can diagnose the problem properly, then we will be able to push the agenda in a much more appropriate way. Now, my understanding of COVID, as I have looked in last 3 months, and looking at climate change, especially international climate change negotiation, what comes out quite clearly is if you have a global acute impact, then it becomes a dog-eat-dog world. Okay, COVID, if there is a small cyclone in Philippines, and you will see all countries donating some money to Philippines and sending relief material. Okay, but if everyone is impacted, you will see huge competition that we have witnessed during COVID period, whether it was with respect to getting PPEs, or for that matter on medicine or expertise, okay, or for that matter in vaccine. We are seeing the beginning of fight that is going to happen on vaccine. Okay, so the worst climatic impact is going to be a dog-eat-dog world. It's not going to be a very cooperative world. I think that's one learning that is quite clear to me. Okay, and it is important for everyone in international climate change negotiations to understand that what we are witnessing in terms of short extreme impacts, maybe there is a cooperative framework to deal with it, but there is no cooperative framework to deal with a global impact once that happens. My second learning from COVID is more Indian. Abhiraj, I'm not going to talk too much about environmental justice simply because I think Tejal has touched upon those issues, and you have also talked about it in your introductory remarks. My second learning is of India and the way decision making is done in India in crisis. Okay, we had experienced it in case of earthquake or cyclones and other things, but the COVID has laid bare the weaknesses that exist in decision making at the central level in terms of using scientific principles and risk analysis before you take a decision, and the weaknesses in state and district level in terms of decision making as well as in terms of implementation. In fact, if there is one learning that I take back from COVID is that India needs major administrative reform. Okay, leave political reform. Okay, our dependence on civil service to deliver, okay, has to be rethought very, very carefully. Because a country of 1.4 billion people and our reliance of, and I have horrid stories of COVID at the district level in terms of enforcing the lockdown. Okay, how it has been done or how decision has been made. Or for example, I live in Delhi NCR and so does Navroz, the way Gurgaon, Haryana and Noida are dealing with COVID together. Though it is a one economic bloc, there is no Noida without Delhi. So that's my second learning that comes out from COVID is that we can keep talking about our India's growth and the need for economic growth and whatever. We have to get our administrative system fixed completely, and especially the capacity at the local and at the state level in terms of taking decisions. I also want to, let me come back to the issue of climate justice, but again, from the perspective of more from the perspective of international cooperation. I believe that the discussion that has happened at UNFCCC on equity and climate justice has not been done with any end in mind, and therefore we don't have anything substantial that has come out in negotiating text or as an outcome from any agreement we have had at the international climate change negotiations. I think when India talks about equity, it uses equity as a means to achieve certain ends. I don't think India is also interested in equity. Okay. We are not interested in equity domestically. I don't think we are interested in equity even internationally. Okay. So this entire debate on climate justice that developing countries has been talking about equity and justice, as far as I am concerned, has not been serious enough to drive the real agenda of equity and justice into international climate negotiation. I also want to talk about, which maybe we will discuss it later, but Tejal did raise the issue of, in fact, you raised the issue of how do we relate with environment, okay? And the discussion that has happened around environmental improvements during COVID, okay? I have written about it, and I think anyone talking about environmental improvement at the misery of millions of people, for me, is not an environmentalist, okay? This is not something that needs to be celebrated. We do not need to improve environment by locking down millions of people and putting millions of people on the road. Okay, I'm not saying that millions of people on the road has happened because of because of COVID itself, but generally, I think environmental improvement during COVID, as has been historically been the case, will be short term. History shows that post-pandemic, the quickest way to increase economic growth is to exploit the environment. That happened in 2008. We can see that between 1918 and 20, after Spanish flu, we had roaring 20s and then the big crash that happened across the world economically. And therefore, I am also not very sure that the governments will come out with some very green package to suddenly become green because they have learned things from COVID. Okay, I think their priority will be to exploit environment, and that we are seeing in terms of coal revival package or mining revival package that the government of India is doing right now. However, as a serious scientific nation, if we are, then we should use COVID as an opportunity to understand what is the base level of pollution. Okay. When your transport sector is shut down, where your industries are shut down, and largely your emissions are coming from households, and your commercial sector is closed, this should give us a fairly good idea about what is the natural pollution level in our part of the world. Why I'm saying this is because whenever there is talk of pollution, whether it is air pollution or water pollution in northern India and other parts of India, we only think about transport sector and industries and some technology will clean it up. But just give you a sense that during COVID, at the peak of lockdown, Delhi's pollution level were in between moderate and high. Okay, and it could come from thermal power plants because thermal power plants were operating at about 70% capacity. But it is largely also coming from natural sources that we need to understand, because we also have an ecological crisis, and that crisis is linked to pollution. So yes, if there is some plus side of COVID, so-called quote unquote, it has given us an opportunity to understand clearly how do we deal with pollution issues. And I think I completely share Tejal's idea that when everything is shut down, we have been able to reduce only about 20% of the global emission. And that tells you how big a challenge it is to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And tinkering with this technology and that technology is not going to be the solution if we are really thinking about meeting 1.5 C goal or between 1.5 C and 2 C goal. So let me end it here.
Thank you very much, Chandra. So certainly want to come back to India is not interested in justice and equity at the national or international level, and want to come back to it with the hope that there are many Indias, and what can we do even if our enchantment with the state leaves us with a resignation that change is not going to come from there. Where are the other pathways? Just a heads up that I'm going to come back to that question later. Let me now invite Navroz. So Navroz, normally my first impulse would be to ask you to go first, but I think I'm keen to see how you reflect to what both Tejal and Chandra, along with my prefatory comments, might mean for you in the context of climate justice and its connection with the COVID pandemic.
Great. Thank you, Viraj. Thanks to Chandra and Tejal for the comments and to the forum for this event. Really stimulating opening salvos. I'll have to call them. Lots to engage with there. And let me just pick up a few things. The first, I think Tejal's right that we have to kind of start with where we are, which is the COVID moment. But I would take it in a slightly different direction. You know, my big learning from the COVID story, I think it's not a learning, it's a reinforcement, is that when we talk about justice, we have to, looking at justice, at the COVID issue through a justice lens has made it clear that we are in a situation of deep structural inequalities and structural unfairness, as a result of which we have built a society where risks are systematically displaced onto others. So the risks that come from air travel and global communication have been displaced onto the poorest and those with the weakest, thinnest, non-existent safety net. And that is where the link to climate justice is really strongest, is that it's brought home to us that in the case of climate impacts too, we will be displacing the risks onto the weakest and those least able to bear them. And I very much take Chandra's point, CB's point about the administrative state. We do not have, forget about steel frame. We do not have a state that is capable of providing a safety net to India's vulnerable at all. But that's the starting point to me, is that it's reinforced the message that, like it or not, this is the society we built in globally, but particularly in India. We displace our risks. That is what we've seen in COVID, and that will also be the case when it comes to climate change in spades. But from there, I want to sort of loop back to the climate equity point more centrally, because that's sort of the theme of this panel, and say that I think we can take from there an observation that we have had, and many of us in this conversation have been part of that, far too reductionist view of what climate equity is as a result. Climate equity has been reduced to, as I think you put it, benefits and burdens and how we allocate them. how do you slice up the carbon pie? That is far too impoverished an idea of climate equity, and that has come straight through with this COVID crisis. There is a broader idea of a society that structurally displaces risks onto the vulnerable is the lens that I think is much richer. And I want to pause a little bit on this allocating the carbon pie kind of story. I want to take a little bit of an issue with Tejal on this. Not only has India, in advocating this fairly unidimensional view of climate equity, not only is it basically been used as a strategic device, right? But I don't think it's irrelevant what we do with the idea of allocating carbon. I mean, Tejal drew a distinction between winning that right and whether we use it or not and how internally. I don't think you can draw that distinction. If India wins some kind of blank check to lots of carbon in the future through the international process, and we then choose to keep it for the elite, I'm not okay with that, actually. I don't think those are separable decisions. And I think actually Tejal, I see her shaking her head, I think she wouldn't agree either. But I think that it is actually incumbent on us to make those a connected conversation. I've been in too many international processes where many of my friends on the left who will batter the government at home will go internationally and defend it and say, no, division of labor, and they're worse guys than our bad guys. I think we can't live in that kind of world. We have to live in a more nuanced world where we're talking about displacing risk. So I think that today on Environment Day, we should be embracing an idea of climate equity that I think has this more encompassing nature, and that ties it to the ability of society more broadly to build structures that don't displace risk and manage that risk better. And it's true for climate, and it's true for COVID. So that's just the first observation I'll make. The second is, I want to walk a little bit of a line here on some of the things that we kind of tossed aside. Behavior and behavioral change, fiscal stimulus packages. Yes, we can't uncritically adopt some of these things, or the COVID blue skies as something to be celebrated. No, I agree with my co-panelists. You can't adopt these things uncritically as templates for India or celebrate them uncritically without looking at what they are, which is again an epiphenomenon of this displacement of risk. But I think we can use them to have a deeper conversation, right? So do we want to toss the fact that people, I work in a think tank, we end up passing most of our ideas through a political filter, right? That's the reality of it. You say, Acha, that would be great, but nahi hoga, forget it. And yet we're in this COVID moment where all kinds of things are happening, behaviors are changing in dramatic ways, people are in good and bad ways, people are being forced to do things that we thought would be impossible to get them to do. Governments are sort of leaping over themselves. You have, in some countries of the world, the norm has become a 20% of GDP fiscal. That's why our government is trying to sort of position what we've done in the 10 to 20% range. And these are huge numbers that were beyond the bounds of political possibility, right? How do we use this moment in a sense as a way of stimulating the imagination, right? And in ways that don't uncritically accept things. Let me take the work from home thing, okay? Yes, a minuscule fraction of India's total workforce is work from home. Our manufacturing workforce clearly can't do it. Lots of the service people, people who come from other places and end up working as chowkidars, whatever, domestic help clearly can't do it. But what if, and we don't know the numbers yet, but what if a reasonably large chunk of the professional services sector could do it? And yes, there's this incentive structure in place, less rental on commercial real estate and so on and so forth. What if we just threw some numbers out, right? If you say 5-10% of elite car-owning commuters find it possible to work from home 2 days a week, something like this, right? Then you have basically reduced your air pollution spike at commuter time. And I'm just making up this stuff here. I don't have the numbers yet. I'm looking into it. It probably reduces that commuter air pollution spike by as much as any other single air pollution policy. It's not going to be huge because nothing is huge in India's, or no, certainly in North India's air pollution problem. Everything is a bite-sized piece at best. Right? Why do we throw that possibility out the window, especially when the victims of air pollution, the worst victims are in fact the poorest, the ones who don't have access to healthcare? You might actually have an equity outcome. You might in fact have a local air pollution outcome. And you now have a situation where people are talking about things they didn't think possible. Why would we not explore that? Right? Why would we just dismiss it? Similarly, clearly the green fiscal stimulus, putting conditions on MSME workers, I completely agree. No way that's going to happen. That shouldn't happen. But does that mean that there should be, that the idea of conditions on large industry in exchange for a bailout to move society in the direction of something that is both sustainable and equitable as a concept should be thrown out? No, right? The devil lies in that implementation detail. I don't think we should dismiss it out of hand. Let's take, and I think what we have right now is a signal lack of imagination. Let's look at the power sector. Yes, power sector demand has gone down. The sector was in crisis before. It's in deeper crisis now. What has the government done? It's given a whack of money to DISCOMs to basically pay their bills to generation companies. So the generation companies can go ahead and service their debts, so you don't have contamination to the banking sector. Okay. Now, is that going to change the fundamental mess in the sector? Not at all. Who are most of the people who are not paying the DISCOMs? Interestingly, it's actually state governments. They have the biggest share of unpaid bills. Why are we not thinking, for example, about using some of that money to write down and prematurely retire old coal-fired power plants, right? That are currently having to be paid fixed charges by distribution companies and are crowding out cleaner plants and renewable energy, right? That would achieve the same kind of economic rebalance in the sector, but would move it to a different place. Now, in each of these cases, we've got to ask, are you hurting the vulnerable? If you are, no go. Absolutely not. You can't burden them. But I think that in some cases, you may not be, right? And it's not like we started in a great place to begin with. So to be clear, I'm not a votary of this kind of, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste thing. That sounds kind of vulture-like and opportunistic. That's not what I'm saying, right? When people are already miserable, they won't notice an additional misery. That's not my argument at all. What I am saying is we see the existing kind of interlocking of society, technology, institutions has shaken free a bit. Before it realigns in the same place, can we come up with a newer realignment that gives us equitable gains, environmental gains, and most importantly, deals with the immediate vulnerability, or it certainly at least doesn't make it worse, right? I think we have to ask those questions. Final point that I'll just make very briefly. I think what we are seeing also, it's part of this argument about looking for walking a line, right? Certainly, you don't want to say, we've talked about, for example, the 17% decline in emissions, right? And I want to take a little bit of issue here with CB, right? You talked about the language of natural pollution level. That is a concept that makes me very uneasy, honestly, CB, because it basically assumes that you're in a static place. The whole point of a climate conversation around the way in which we build society is we have turnover, we're building in new ways, and I'm really worried about arguments that unintentionally, and I know this is unintentional, play into the hands of a government that says our first priority has to be to get back to normal. Well, normal was not a great place, actually. Again, not on the backs of the poor, by no means, right? Absolutely not. But we don't want to get into the narrative either, as our environment minister said, right? He said, we have now seen what the cost of clean air is. The cost of clean air is no industry, no transport, everybody stays at home. We have to be very careful about reinforcing that narrative, because lots of societies there are alternative ways of giving livelihood. There are alternative ways of economic activity, and we all know that. And that's what we want. We want to imagine those different ways. So we want to walk a line between celebrating uncritically blue skies and economic shutdown, and falling into a trap of reinforcing a view that says the only way to get environmental gains is through shutdown of economic activity, and therefore we have to relax coal mining restrictions, drop environmental safeguards, and so on. So we have to be creative about this. It's a complicated conversation that this COVID has opened up. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Navroz. So I think
I just want to. I think Navroz got it wrong. What I said about 17% pollution was greenhouse, but the point I was making here was with respect to air pollution, and that there is a natural pollution source that we need to take care of if we really want to meet air quality and water quality. It was not in context of global greenhouse gases and 17%. So these were two very different issues. Just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Chandra. So I was delighted every time Navroz took issue with someone or even chose to recognize that there might be a think tank perspective and a non-think tank Navroz perspective. So I want to get into that space as well. I think the conversation has been fantastic so far because a few sort of very broad themes have come out that I think are useful for everyone who's here to appreciate the complexity of this wicked problem, if you wish, right? There is, I think one point is recognizing that India has a unique context and will require unique solutions and even a unique perspective. Second, there are different dynamics at play in international negotiations and in domestic policy. I think all three of you all have agreed that there is a crisis that really does not know what to do with decision making in the context of risk and what happens to that risk, which comes basically down to injustice towards communities that are already vulnerable. And I think the fourth point, maybe none of you all articulated it in this way, but I find it useful to in a sense, reflect on it in this way, is that there are a lot of options. Sometimes these options are conflicting, sometimes these options are coeval, but there are a lot of options. And I think most everyone agrees that there is no single silver bullet solution. So it's useful in the context of India to at least begin to appreciate and collect all of the options. And my own sort of frustration with climate conversations in India is quite often the downscaling, the what does this mean for my city? What does this mean for my community, my neighborhood, my own history in this geographical location does not happen. It's very broad conversations that don't bring in that specificity. So I'm delighted to see all of these options come up, and I do think I want to hear from Tejal on how she feels about Navroz's comments on possibilities, even while thinking through a green stimulus, or what I found an interesting provocative point there, that is what would somewhat strict regulation of big enterprises mean in the context of India. So let me invite you all to sort of have a second round of, it'll have to be somewhat quick, but a second round of reflections here. And I think for the benefit of our diverse audience, I want to ask the question in this way, which is, when we are talking about climate change, we are often talking only about mitigation. That is, and let me just sort of caricature it. That is, let's move to electric vehicles right away, and that will save the world. Or we are talking only about adaptation, that is, and let me again caricature it, that is, we really need to develop the ability of the fisherwoman in the Sundarbans to deal with a cyclone like Amphan. And quite often resilience comes in, and people are sometimes linking resilience to adaptation. Sometimes they're drawing out deeper connections between resilience and mitigation. So my question to you is, if we are in agreement that a climate justice lens is a useful lens to adopt while thinking of India and climate change, what for you is either unexplored or underexplored, or really, really urgent to focus on? And it would be interesting if you just think of it in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And this is with the caveat noted that, of course, we want all three. But if you had to really place your flag somewhere at this moment, where would that be? So let me again turn it back to Tejal. And Tejal, you have about 3 to 4 minutes to respond to those comments, and also quickly toss the ball back to Navroz if you wish.
Quite a lot to respond to in very less time, Abhairaj, because you've also posed a lot of questions. I think I'll begin before I respond to Navroz, and it's an old fight. So I'm sure it's not going to get resolved in a matter of this panel, but nevertheless, I do want to respond to that. But I do want to differentiate between the fact that I don't think it's a very good idea to, while it's important to think about what is important locally in terms of mitigation actions, and especially in terms of local pollution, I think to remove the context, global context of mitigation, and because the conversations are at that level, when we talk about what we should do locally, I think leads to all kinds of confusions. It's a bit scary. If you look at what's happening currently in the IPCC process, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have a push for what are known as shared socioeconomic pathways, right? This is basically trying to scale down some kind of a global understanding. So into what it would mean locally for, and there are people who are doing it for cities, not just countries. Now, what happens is mitigation is a collective action problem. It's a global problem. It is not a problem of an individual. So I might turn vegan. I'll decide not to take my car and use public transport and do all kinds of things, and I will still drown with the rest of my community if the US decides to not do anything about it, right? So the sticking point in this entire debate on climate justice and the focus on mitigation actually, I think, comes from this particular aspect, and the fact that it's carbon dioxide, which is not really a local pollutant, which makes this, in fact, a more difficult problem. And in that vein, I would want to respond to Navroz by saying that, of course, it's important how we use the pie, how we use our share of the carbon space. But given what has happened continuously throughout the history of debates on climate justice, in the UNFCCC or in the IPCC, and especially also given, and I think CB mentioned it quite clearly, what has happened with the pandemic right now in terms of the global scenario. I think to say that there is some kind of a global civil society or a global academia which takes a much more nuanced view of things, and a view of things which is much more global and not differentiated by sovereign borders, I think would be incorrect, and also ignore the history of the negotiations, because global civil society is a joke. You have civil society organizations, NGOs, academia of the first world have taken positions that favor the first world, ignored literature that favors the third world. So this, while it might be a thing of the past, this division between the first world and the third world and whatever, in terms of political negotiation, I think in terms of how people live and the reality of our systems of production or even our governments, I think this distinction is still very much real. Maybe there are some nuances here and there, but nevertheless, India very firmly falls into a category of the least developed countries. And so I think it's important to safeguard a strategic resource like the carbon space, and definitely maybe talk about how we are going to use it, and that fight for justice domestically goes on. But I think it is not safeguarding a strategic resource is also sort of giving it up in the long run. And I think more concretely, we have all kinds of other things, not just the safeguarding of the carbon resource, but the fact that we have things that are being pushed now quite disingenuously, like insurance-based frameworks were pushed for the health sector by the World Bank in India. You have insurance-based policies that are being pushed for agriculture and adaptation in the climate change arena. Now, given our experience of the pandemic, is that something that we should be, looking forward to going for in the climate change debate? How does that deal with climate justice? Are big questions, and I think those things also need to be attacked quite significantly, because I think you spoke about risk, Navroz, and I think the problem of risks and differentiated risks is a result of the underlying scarcity and inequality of access to infrastructure and resources. I think so. Therefore, providing for that is the first step. Reducing inequality is one thing, but it's not as if reducing inequality means that everybody is equally poor, right? So providing access to all of these is an important priority for a country like India. And I think this is very when we think about. And I agree with you that, I mean, I'm not saying that you're advocating something like green opportunism, but does it become necessary to advocate non-green policies at some point of time? And you took the example of the power sector. I agree with you. We should stop the old power plants, run the newer power plants better. There's a cost implication there, but it environmentally might be better. But right now, when you have a lower demand in the power sector, we still have the must-run status for renewable energy. The more expensive, older solar plants are running, and the energy that has been generated from them at 7 rupees, 8 rupees, 9 rupees, distribution companies are forced to buy it. Maybe during a crisis to say that's fine, it's all right. Let's, for this few months, not force green policies down the throats of distribution companies so that we can do something about the debt would be useful. And so therefore, I think a much more, let's say, circumspect approach into how we think about climate and environment in the context is necessary, especially in a country like ours. And I would stand by the point that I made earlier in terms of green fiscal packages in that respect. Yeah, I'm sorry, I took a little more time, I think, then.
No worries. Thanks, Tejal. So over to you, Chandra. And I think people in the Q&A box are also interested in your comments on why India does not think about equity at all. But I would invite you to, in a sense, respond to what Tejal just said, and also your own sense of the mitigation, adaptation, resilience trilemma, if I may.
Okay. So I had kept certain points for the second part of the dialogue, but let me put it here right now. Let me first say, because I think this discussion between carbon pie that is happening between Navroz and Tejal, there is no carbon pie left, frankly speaking. I don't know why we are even bloody talking about it. Okay. It is equal to 8% of global emissions, or maybe 8 years or 10 years or 12 years. How does it matter? Okay. So I think this entire debate about dividing the carbon pie is absolutely unnecessary. We have gone beyond that. The water has passed under the bridge a long time back. Okay. In this discussion of carbon pie, the fact is China took most of the carbon pie. And none of the developing countries bleeding hard on carbon pie ever questioned China. Okay, so I also want to, let's be very brute about this issue, because we all have spent years of our lives, and there's some amount of frustration that is coming out, but we've spent years of our lives discussing this useless topic, okay, that we will divide. It was never possible to divide. Which country is going to give up their right to development unless until they have technology? Can you force US to close coal-based power plants? It will close because they have alternatives. So the world never worked on alternative for 30 years and kept discussing how do we divide the carbon pie. So let me just say that that debate about dividing the carbon pie is not the way to move ahead. And so is not UNFCCC as a platform. Okay, any one of us who are spending time on UNFCCC platform is wasting our time. Okay, we need to think about something else. Okay? We need to think about. I've talked about it. I think there are much more opportunities on regional cooperation and national cooperation to spend time between developing at the UNFCCC. Now, regarding the question that some people have asked, why I believe India doesn't, advocate equity, the records show. I mean to say, if you look at submission of Government of India at UNFCCC, majority of submission is with respect to carbon market. So go through the 30 years of record and see on what point has Government of India intervened. Okay, there is not one Indian submission, or maybe just one, on adaptation. Okay, so if equity is important for India, and we all understand that poor are going to be the worst affected by climate change, then India should have been talking about adaptation and loss and damage long time back. Okay. We haven't. We have used equity as a tool for a long time so that no one pushes us to take mitigation commitment. Okay, we have used it as a, as a strategy. So that is why I'm saying, and for a long time, including environmentalists like me, have opposed discussing equity within the country. Okay. So let me also say that I am as guilty of this entire hypocrisy that has happened over a long time in climate change debate in the country. Okay. So for a long time we said, no, we will not discuss equity domestically. Equity is an international issue. Okay. So I think I completely agree with Navroz, and we agree on certain point. And let me say that I agree that I think the time has come to transparently look at, remove all the fog and look at it what we are facing right now. Okay. And that is the second point I wanted to make, that if there is something like, even partly something like COVID keeps happening every year in about 25% of the world, then the world economy as we know it is over. Okay. And it is quite possible that 1/4 of the world in next 5 years will start experiencing devastating climate impact, if not 100%. But COVID also tell us another thing that, and I think this was a headline in Economist, that 90% economy doesn't work. Okay, if we think that we can close 10% of the economy and hope 90% will work, it will not. Similarly, 90% of the world will not work. 100% of the world will have to come together and work if we are looking at a global economic system. Now, the last point I want to make, and then I will just take one more minute to talk about the priorities, but let me just say that I am very uncomfortable with the way Atmanirbhar Bharat is being discussed in India. Okay. We have had 40 years of Atmanirbhar Bharat before 1991. And we have run one of the worst industrial technology. I remember going to an ACC plant in late 1980s in Jharkhand. And the entire city was, white. So I have also seen the impact of Atmanirbhar Bharat, where we think we can do it. And frankly speaking, so this entire anti-globalization talk, I do not agree with the current globalization, which is based on cheap labor or exploitation of nature. But I also do not agree with isolating and creating a narrative against globalization. Okay, there are advantages of globalization. The Zoom technology that we are using, or the software technology we are using, is a product of globalization. Technology will play a major role in solving climate change. So I don't think this discussion on Atmanirbhar Bharat makes me very uncomfortable. And as I wrote recently in my op-ed in Times of India, that Atmanirbharta has to be affordable and sustainable. Okay, it can't be exorbitant and unsustainable, which could be the case. That's how we are thinking about coal right now. Okay, let me end by saying, what are the urgent priorities? I don't think India should be, I will say it is all the ticks. We will have to work on mitigation, because there are sectors where mitigation is now profitable to the economy and to the ecology. We will have to think about adaptation. And I think one of the big work on adaptation will be governance. Okay, forget about giving insurance and safety net for our farmers. Okay, how will those be implemented on the ground is the main factor now. We have seen how benefits are being distributed right now. Okay, so governance is going to be the most important thing for a country like India if we are looking at adaptation and resilience building. Otherwise, they will remain in the textbook. So I will not prioritize. We will have to tick all the columns as far as climate action is concerned.
Thanks, Chandra. I heard some of the passion and the frustration there, and I have to always thank anyone who points out that they too have been complicit at some stage in their life with something that, on reflection now, they recognize as not desirable. That brand of honesty is often missing in many of our pseudo academic discussions, and it's nice to have that come into this space. Let me now invite Navroz. So Navroz, you have again a lot on your plate, so I'll let you choose how you want to sort of orient your comments.
Thanks, Abhiraj, but just some guidance from you. Would it be helpful to sort of get into this kind of relative mitigation, adaptation, resilience sort of? Is that where you'd like to take the conversation?
That's one thing that I am interested in hearing your opinion on, but I think both Tejal and Chandra have also said some interesting things and in a sense spoken to some of your earlier comments. So yeah. The other, I think, point that for me was interesting is just squaring up with Chandra's comment on how India has not internationally really been active with adaptation, and in that sense, to use his words again, the carbon pie discussion has sort of just taken up a lot of time, energy, and space while poor and vulnerable people drown and die in different parts of this country today. So for me, that had a resonance as well. But I'll still leave it to you in terms of what you think will add best to the sort of confluence of ideas we have here today.
Okay. Great, thanks so much. So I just want to start by noting that Tejal said that this is an old fight, and I think it's perhaps this question of the carbon pie and allocation and India's role and so on. I think it's more of a long-running learning moment, and I've certainly benefited from the conversation over the years with Tejal, and I think we both even enjoy the back and forth. I think there's a lot of richness there and a lot of nuance that we capture from engaging in this. But there is a risk of flogging that horse too much, so I will not go much deeper into that discussion. But I will maybe pick up on Chandrabhushan's point. I think I think the argument he's made about very little carbon pie left. It's kind of he made this point at a seminar in Delhi around the time of the Paris Agreement, if I remember, or the IPCC 1.5 report. It was kind of a head-snapping moment for a lot of people in the room, including me. I think it's a very powerful point. And I'm sympathetic also to Tejal's point of view, which says, there is certainly a narrative resource that our negotiators have used over the years that says, look, you guys really have caused this problem. And one of our seasoned ambassadors, Ambassador Das Gupta, who is very, very skillful, would always argue it like this. He says, if you had a world food crisis, would you ask the people who are on a pitiful starvation diet to eat less? You wouldn't. Why are you doing that with carbon, right? So I think the North-South equity story has not disappeared, because what you bring to the table, what you demand of others, I mean, it is very much kind of takes off from that point. But it's one reason I also think we should keep the behavioral stuff on the table, because it's some things that may not have a lot of resonance here today. And I think Tejal is right that our priorities are somewhere else, has a lot of resonance somewhere else, right? And narratives, we don't live in a single unified world with a global civil society. Tejal is completely correct. But we do increasingly live in a world with very powerful global narratives. Right, so you don't want to necessarily dismiss those narratives because they're powerful in other places. So, for example, just take the 1.5 conversation. Chandrabhushan was part. In fact, Chandrabhushan and both Tejal were part of a group that made a very powerful intervention when the 1.5 report came out, saying, "Listen, 1.5 probably isn't achievable, and all it's done is given a bunch of developed and rich countries cover to claim that they're climate champions by cloaking themselves in this mantle." And I agree. I think it was a very powerful point. However, what I've found is that, duplicitous in some ways as it was to the science, it has proved to be an incredibly powerful rallying cry for youth movements and social movements in the UK, Extinction Rebellion, all of these people that have moved their societies. I think they've played some role in moving their societies. It's always hard to attribute this, in terms of causality of politics, but it's moved those societies quite far along to taking climate seriously as an organizing principle for their societies, and somewhat internalizing the equity, the equity arguments as well, right? So I think these narratives can be powerful, and we have to work with them in that sort of multi-stranded way. In terms of mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and so on and so forth, I think the and this is another long-standing discussion. I think the Paris Agreement was a very significant moment, because in shifting the conversation to nationally determined contributions, it basically said what Chandra just said. The world was never going to divide up the pie. And I agree with him. India never really pushed very hard for those kinds of views. Let me give you a little anecdote. Prior to Paris, there was a group of African countries trying to push for what they call an equity reference framework. That said, all right, we're going to have some kind of bottom-up pledges, but let's have a reference framework based on equity that every country's contribution is benchmarked to. So it's not entirely bottom-up, but that it's hinged to something where we look at what the implicit division of the pie is. Indian government would have nothing to do with it. They were not interested, right? So I agree with that. But to come back to the main point, the Paris Agreement kind of shifted the frame of reference to say, we realize that whatever you guys do in mitigation, adaptation, resilience terms is going to be driven by your national conversation. It's at the margin going to be driven by something international. And if it's going to be driven by something international, it'll probably be the World Bank coming in and dangling some money for a market readiness program or something like this. But no country is going to lock themselves into a 20, 30-year trajectory because of an international process. It's going to be driven by the exigencies of domestic context. And so where we are right now, and this brings us back full circle to the COVID discussion, where we are right now is what kind of society do we want to build that meets all the needs that we have, which include livelihoods, perhaps first, and decent livelihoods, safety nets, local environmental factors, contribution to mitigation, and a range of others. And importantly, very important, I think the solving the problem of very poor social sectors, health and education, and so on. And what are then the trade-offs and synergies between doing all those things? On occasion, can we make those things come together, right? And where we have trade-offs, then we have to accept those trade-offs. So recently I've been part of international conversations where we talk about India's LPG program, which, to be honest, I think is probably the one thing, the single thing, the thing that the government should get most credit for in the energy space. It's a big deal. It started, as many things did with earlier governments, but expansion of LPG for cooking has the potential, not fully realized, to reduce indoor air pollution. And by the way, it'll also have some, it may have some climate gains, depending on what else they use. But the important point is that in many cases, it actually may be worse from a mitigation point of view. So there's an example of a trade-off, right? Something that we want to do for development may be worse from mitigation. And I think India should completely do it. We can't be dominated by the mitigation story. So those are the kinds of, on the other hand, public transport in our cities decreases congestion, decreases air pollution, decreases greenhouse gases. So we have to look for these points of convergence and try and create positive politics around it. So to me, both the mitigation story and the adaptation, these boundaries of mitigation, adaptation, resilience are in a sense flawed boundaries. We think more in terms of the epistemic communities we have and the bureaucratic structures we have. We talk about urbanization. We talk about agriculture and cropping patterns. We talk about forest sectors. And I think those, and we need to find ways of bringing these objectives together in the context of those conversations, structured as those conversations. Because that's where the knowledge and the epistemic communities and the bureaucratic structures and often the politics are already sort of coalesced. So that's how I would encourage us to think about it.
Thanks very much.
And just, sorry, the last one, the reason I said I think the Paris Agreement in a sense is productive is because it opens the doors to those kinds of conversations rather than trying to sort of, immediately go into what does it mean in terms of division of carbon pie and so on.
Thanks very much, Nowroz. And I think you bringing us back full circle is rather timely as well. I think I too note the Paris Agreement in some sense creates space for both a human rights approach and an emphasis on participatory and gender sensitive frameworks. And I think your own colleague Lavanya has been also exploring this in the academic space. So there have been several requests now to come back to this city context, right? And I'm not sure how familiar each of you are with Bangalore and its intricacies, but I do know that you'll have all been here several times. But what I'm going to encourage now is sort of riffing off your point, Nowroz, on as we imagine what kind of world we want and what kind of politics are possible, one assumption, if I may, is that we're not necessarily going to see a huge transformative change of approach flowing out of the Prime Minister's office like that, right? So we know that political spaces and political possibilities are conditioned by many histories in that sense. So the question is, do you think Indian cities, Bangalore, Delhi, any other city, Bombay, that you want to bring into the conversation, do you think these could be frontiers for a new climate just India? I mean, and I don't expect it to unroll evenly across the country in one go. In past sort of conversations that the Bangalore International Center has organized, we have noted, like Chandra did, that the administrative devolution and the power devolution in India has just been an unfulfilled promise. That is, there is no real power that has gone to the city. That said, we are seeing, based on my research, my own observation, that there are some emergent possibilities. So I would like each one of you all to just sort of think of, do you think we're going to see new transformative possibilities come first from our cities? Do you have any stories that would give us some hope or inspiration in this context? And if we as city residents want to actually experiment with this line of speculative possibility, what should we be doing? I mean, we should, one, be talking to each other, but are there more ideas for how we can try and realize these possibilities? So let me switch orders now, or Tejal, are you feeling all right with going first? If you're ready, then I'm happy to continue with the order. All right, so let's
Yeah.
go with Tejal.
Yeah, all right. So I think I won't respond to any of that, because otherwise we'll keep going forward. I'll take this question on the cities. I think, we must remember that cities are traditionally, historically transformative in nature. They provide opportunity to break out of pre-modern relations of production, modes of production. So in terms of caste, in terms of gender, and in terms of all the other inequalities that are vestiges of a pre-modern era, cities provide the basis for the transformation. They provide a promise of transformation. I'm not saying that they necessarily deliver on that promise always and equally, but they are transformative in that sense. And that's the, I think one of the issues with the entire climate debate has been that it has sort of, everybody thinks that we need to reinvent the wheel, and all the lessons that we have from development economics, from the development sector in general, especially in developing countries, of the last 50, 60 years, we've sort of thrown it out of the window. And it plays no role in our understanding in the climate debate, for example. So I think that's wrong. We should bring it back. So in that sense, that is how we should look at cities. And in terms of concrete options, I think Navroz spoke about public transports, etc. And these are things that obtain even otherwise. We don't have to go through a crisis to actually think about the fact that this is an obvious choice. I mean, it's an easily accessible choice. Even something like LPG, for example. But what we have to think about now maybe is, what about housing, right? We have probably woken up to the fact that we need public health care as a necessary component of how we think about development in the future. And I think we also need to add to that, I mean, not just in terms of what does social distancing mean in the slums of Mumbai or the slums of Bangalore, and what it has meant for the migrant workers and the migrant worker colonies that have been part of so many cities. This is sort of, it's much more current, that debate. But nevertheless, the fact of housing and the provision of housing, at one point of time, there was at least some sense that industries had of providing housing to their employers. This also meant that employees lived in areas that are close by. We've moved away from that, and not just in terms of some understanding of suburbia from the US, but even in terms of how we think about spaces where production happens in a city and spaces where social reproduction happens, where people live and people, how people, let's say, spend their time where they're not actually engaged actively in production, I think is an area where we've not really given enough thought, and we've not given enough thought of what our demands should be, what our articulations of justice in this respect should be. And I think it's not just affordable housing. Hiranandani in Mumbai, for example, provides affordable housing. It's hardly affordable housing. I mean, we don't need to even, I think, we don't need to say anything more about that. But public housing is, I think, something that we should be talking about it. And it's not part of any of our debates on climate change. It's no longer a part of our debates on development as well. So I think we need to bring back some of these things in the way we talk about it. And I think what happens, why the international context remains important, is because pressures from there make it difficult for us to be able to deliver on some of these things on adaptation or even on development, right? If we are to think about where money is going to come from for an energy transition, then there obviously is less money available for other things. And this, of course, is removed. Let's assume that we have somebody who really wants to do something for the people in government. Let's assume that we have, this sort of does not speak to what a particular government does or successive governments have done throughout. So I think in terms of where the international context still remains important is that it impinges on our ability to be able to provide people with what they need. And even if the international context was all clear, it's not as if our government would have necessarily done so. Given that disclaimer, even then, I think the international pressures do play an important role. Look at the kind of target setting that we've been doing for renewable energy. 450 gigawatts, 275 gigawatts, to ward off pressure from international. But we've almost started believing that we need to deliver on all of those targets as immediately as possible. There are already reports that are saying that, by 2027, we should be doing this, 2030, we should be doing that. And this means that we have lesser money available for other things. So these are actual impacts of something like that. But, we need to rethink also in terms of what kinds of how we articulate our demands for infrastructure as well. And it should go beyond what is easily accessible, like public transport and LPG. It should go beyond that, talk about things that may not necessarily be fashionable right now.
Thanks very much, Tejal. So let me now invite Chandra to respond to the same question. I've tried to bring in some of the questions in the Q&A box into my questions to you without necessarily going over them one by one. I also noticed a couple of people have been quite provocative with their questions. So it's a nice political space there. There's one gentleman, Sandeep, who I know, who's unsatisfied with the lack of clear answers. I wish it was as simple as pulling out a rabbit out of a hat. With all of that noted, yes, Chandra, possibilities for cities and anything you want to say in that context.
So when I think about city, I think about 6,000 cities and census town in this country. Okay, I don't think about Mumbai and Bengaluru and Kolkata. I think big cities have their own dynamics, but I think we have to seriously think about 5,900 other cities and census town that is going to become much more important going ahead. In fact, if you look at the latest data on urbanization, then it is class 2 and class 1 cities and that are growing at a much more rapid pace, even in suburban areas. So I think about Aligarh and Bahadurgarh when I think about cities and climate change. Okay. So though Mumbai Municipal Corporation can have a budget bigger than the budget of some states, what do Aligarh do for climate change? Or Bahadurgarh? Okay, or for that matter, Ramgarh. And I can keep naming Garh, all the cities that are there. So I think when we talk about urbanization and climate, somehow we forget that there are 5,900 other urban places in this country. And those places leave housing that Tejal has talked about, which is I'll come back to that housing issue. They don't have basic infrastructure for water supply and sanitation. Okay. And uneven electricity supply, even if we can claim that, we have overcapacity in the electricity sector. And vestige of the kind of municipal governance where you don't even have a junior engineer to do civil engineering work. So I think we have to be realistic about urbanization in this country. Our focus has largely been on big cities. And that has meant that we have not looked at urbanization in a much more holistic fashion, also for economic diversification regionally. But the migrant crisis tells you, that how some 4 or 5 or 6 big cities is the magnet for economic opportunity. It is so visible. And that's not the kind of urbanization you want. Okay. And all this is not organic. Many people argue that big cities grow organically. I'm sorry, no. Big cities grow because government put its investments there. Okay. Mumbai became big and continues to become big because it is the financial capital by certain government policy, or by that there is Bombay Stock Exchange and National Stock Exchange and everything else has to be in Mumbai historically. So it is not that there has been an organic, we have to redefine organic growth. Okay, and Delhi, for example, because It is the administrative capital and judicial capital of the country. Okay. And I was quite fascinated with Andhra Chief Minister deciding that he's going to have 3 capitals. And everyone lampooned him. But I thought that he had some nice ideas in terms of how he redistributes economic opportunity in different parts of the state. South Africa has done it. So also we have to think very differently in terms of urbanization. How do we even take money and power out of Mumbai and give it to Nasik, for example? If we are looking at much more balanced urbanization. So first thing is that I think there are much bigger, urbanization is much bigger than the million plus cities that we talk about. The second issue is that on urbanization and climate change, you talked about power, that they don't have power, but I think they don't have capacity. So I'm a little uncomfortable with devolving power and not having capacity to enforce it. I mean to say, whenever I go to a city, I do ask people, who's your mayor? 99% of the time, people can't name their mayor of the city. Okay, mayors are not accountable. They do have power, but even their own citizens don't remember, who that mayor is. They will remember the chief minister. So also the power and accountability and capacity of the cities are very closely interlinked, and we shouldn't only talk about power devolution in the cities without thinking about accountability and capacity issue. The last point I wanted to come to, Tejal, because it is related to climate change. We now have this government and the previous government came out with a major affordable housing program. And the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development has come out with a compendium of technology for building those houses. And I'll encourage all of you to read the compendium. Okay. The most climate harmful house that you can build, those technologies are listed there. Why? Because these houses can be built very quickly. So you get prefabricated concrete blocks to build these houses because, again, it is political expediency. You want to show your voter that I have built 100,000 house for you, even though that house is not livable and is going to become even worse going ahead as temperature increases. So also in terms of what kind of cities we are building, I don't think we have touched on that issue.
Thanks very much, Chandra. So I think I fully take on board your point that a fetishization of the big cities is not necessarily the just way of thinking about what's at stake in the context of climate change in India. That said, I should point out that the nonprofit that I am sort of a co-founder of is also premised on, it's called the Initiative for Climate Action, and it's premised on something akin to what Tejal alluded to, which is sometimes one city in a country with many thousand cities might be the experimental space where something new and different emerges. And if it really works there is some magic to it. It has a chance of being picked up by other cities or even embraced by the national government. So that's the premise on which we are focusing on our initial efforts on Bangalore, at least. And I think if you think of a city like Rotterdam, which is, or even Madrid, in some sense, some big cities have provided encouragement and inspiration to many other cities as well, akin to what Navroz was also mentioning in the context of how the Paris Agreement provided inspiration for XR and other activist groups. So let me quickly turn over to Navroz, and here I just want to recognize two questions that are on this topic. So Navroz, maybe you can just include consideration of them if you wish. One is a question relating to nature-based solutions, which I think the BIC panels over the last few months have also explored. In fact, my colleague Harini's talk today is also on this theme, that there's a nature-based solution in the context of big cities or cities in India have resonance, have value as an idea. The other question, I think, going back to what Chandra just said, uh, is the logic of urbanization in India itself so tainted with a particular massive accumulation and disregard for nature that thinking of cities as frontiers for new possibilities is not worth it? I mean, I'm reinterpreting Gaurav's question, but in that sense, will the solution not really come from urban frames that are already controlled and conditioned by logics that are not going to create space for transformative possibilities? So I'll just add those for you, and feel free to respond again based on what you think would be most useful for all of us.
Okay, thank you. I'm also aware that we're running out of time, so I'll try and be as brief as I can. If you don't mind, let me set aside the nature-based solution question, because I really don't know enough about it. It's a new term, new jargon that I am a little wary of, and I'd rather not dive into that. I think there's enough there to take on. I think it's an important question, but it's something that I will overtly duck. You know, in terms of the larger question about cities and the logic of urbanization and the sort of this round of comments, again, others on this panel know much more than I do about it. I certainly agree that when we talk about cities, we have to, the starting point has to be CP's point, that the patterns of urbanization and indeed the patterns of labor and productive labor, my understanding is that actually it's India's pattern of urbanization has been such that you're seeing manufacturing and labor actually much more dispersed than in other countries. Again, it's not something I'm that familiar with as an area, but that's my understanding from some of my colleagues. A vision, so certainly, I think Tejal quite nicely said, look, you know, let's look at the lessons of history here, right? Cities have played a very important role, which doesn't mean, and we should indeed take those lessons of history, but doesn't mean we can't re-envision the sorts of role that cities will play, which is your point. And I think the somewhat hoary point, but it's something that is fair to say, is that India is actually only partway through what historically has been kind of an urbanization transition that we will expect to see. And we do have choices about the nature of that transition. Now, one of the things we haven't brought up in this panel at all, which is quite extraordinary, is renewable energy and the cost of renewable energy. And I think that's actually it's a very interesting moment for India to be going through this transition. Not necessarily interesting good, maybe interesting bad, but the renewable energy story, where you're basically, for the first time in decades, basically seeing the ascendance, not yet full ascendance, but the ascendance of a technology that is modular and scalable, where you don't have economies of scale, gives you a whole different way of imagining the urbanization story, right? It's not part of the logic of urbanization is the scale economies and all kinds of things, including in energy. Well, you've suddenly taken the scale economies of energy out of the story. What is that going to mean, right? We're also in a once in a century pandemic which has exposed great vulnerabilities to people who have to migrate thousands of kilometers. Is that then going to change the way in which people think about where the balance of their possibilities lies? I think we are in a moment where these things are in flux. So yeah, we should definitely learn from the past. There are some sort of, you know, some factors that continue to be powerful, but there's some others that have changed, notably COVID and notably renewable energy. So again, it is kind of a moment for reimagination, and that reimagination is unfortunately beyond my pay grade and knowledge of this space. But let me actually say one last thing. Another number that has stuck with me from some of my colleagues who do work on urbanization much more. They gave the contrast, and CB made a very good point that in terms of urban and local governance, we really haven't we haven't really gone very far down that road, despite the 74th Amendment. A colleague, Partho Mukhopadhyay, who many of you will know, told me that in China, 50% of public finances flow through municipalities. In India, the number is 3%. So the potential to actually transform the landscape through movement of public finance is much more limited in India, right? And so the kind of the governance point, both the capacity point that CB made, but also sort of the access to finance point, put some intrinsic limits to how far we can walk in re-envisioning these spaces at the moment. But I think this is a really interesting moment at which that re-envisioning can happen.
Thanks very much, Navroz. So we have extended over time, and we have announced that we want to close decisively by 8:15. Tejal, one pointed question to you when you said degrowth was over-romanticized. The activist in me felt a little sad because I thought it might be possible to create a space for degrowth, at least in our cities, where we didn't necessarily have to import something from whatever, the south of France, but could have a sort of simpler presence on the land, and do this in a way that was not necessarily privileged, but just allowed us to use the land of our cities more wisely. So just I think a question has come to you on that as well. Do you think there is no sort of space to explore alternative imaginaries of how we construct our societies that are not necessarily based on a high economic growth model, where of course the connected effects on who gets squeezed as a result of that model also being a part of the story, a total transformation to a city not necessarily consuming so much, to invoke Guha, using local resources, and also using very, very limitedly. You don't agree with those possibilities at all?
Well, let me say that I actually don't understand what in a lot of sense when people talk about degrowth, what they actually mean eludes me. But in terms of local use of resources and local availability of trying to sort of create carbon neutral spaces, let's say, I must say that I am very skeptical, because I think there is some sense to the division of labor. There is a reason why society moved. There's a historical reason why society moved towards a division of labor as a means to produce in society. An older society was full of more drudgery. I mean, I think the romanticization, what I am skeptical of, especially as a woman, is of this going back to the land and working, because the most primitive forms of exploitation, where it began with the division of labor within the family, where you have more burden on the woman in the family. So I think when we talk about these sort of, I think I do think it comes from a place of privilege. This understanding that we can somehow negate the historical trajectory, which has not even benefited. The promise of it has not even reached a large majority of the people. So do I envision a different system? Of course I do. I think capitalism is the end of it? No, I don't. I think socialism is possible, and I am willing to work towards socialism. But do I think that it is based on some romantic notion of everybody producing their own things, or everybody doing something in, I think sort of this utopian understanding of Atmanirbharta, of everybody, depending sort of some extreme self-reliance, form of self-reliance, is as utopian as assuming that globalization is inherently equalized. I think both ends of the spectrum are a problem. And that's my take on degrowth. I think we can't afford to be ahistorical in the way in which we think about it. But if you're talking about socialism as the alternative, I'm all for it.
All right. So thank you for clarifying, and I think that was useful for us. Not even going to dream of trying to summarize or synthesize the the richness that came out here. We are at our appointed time, so I'm going to just turn to Chandra and Navroz. I think Tejal had a good last words there. That can be a slogan as well. Chandra and Navroz, sorry, not too much time, but one thing you want for us to take away as your final words or comments here? Either of you, whoever wants to go first. You'll have to unmute Chandra.
Navroz has a very refined way of saying things that, renewable has arrived, and he will use his academic language to say this. Let me say it as bluntly, that I think the time has come for us to look at renewable, and I am not one of them who is looking at target of 450. I'm the one who is looking at affordability of energy now. I think we have to look at renewable from the lens of affordability. 3 weeks back, one can, before that 3 months back, there was a tender for peaking of renewable, which came at about 3 rupees some paisa, and people said it's a fluke. Then 3 weeks back, it is round the clock at 2 rupees 90 paisa. People are saying it's the fluke. I think we will be doing the biggest mistake of our life, okay, in this country and the development trajectory of this country, if we take what is happening with the renewable sector, and especially, it is not technology innovation that is happening. It is the management innovation of renewable energy in terms of putting things together. That if we keep thinking that renewable is a fluke and coal is going to be the basis of our primary energy source going ahead, we would be doing the biggest mistake of our life. We will not be able to even provide affordable energy to the poor, about whom we are talking about climate justice. So let me end by saying that coal is going to become much, much more expensive for the poor than renewable. And I'm talking about 24/7 renewable. No target setting here. Let affordability be the indicator to move to the newer technology. If coal is affordable, fine. But if it is not, then we should be clear enough to say no coal now. Okay. And it seems that renewable is much more affordable and become much more affordable going ahead in future.
Thank you, Chandra. I'm worried that a new 1-hour conversation can start off on just this point. So Navroz, request to you to close it with very brief final words.
Okay, thanks so much. So first of all, I agree that renewables has shifted not just the technology, but the politics and the possibilities. And that's an interesting conversation. I will just scan through the comments, and there's a comment from Sandeep, who you talked to earlier, who said nobody has really talked about the fact that, the title, there is no planet B. And, here's the tension. Yes, climate change is an existential problem. But for 2 decades, trying to think of it as an existential problem and therefore find a global cooperative solution led to incredibly constipated politics and no progress. And so this flip that but can you ignore the fact that there are hard limits, as CB has said, the 1.5 report, finite carbon budget, as Tejal and our colleagues have said for many years? No, you can't ignore that either. So then you're in this world where you have to sort of look for possibilities in the moment and use the fact of an existential crisis down the road to amplify those possibilities as much as you can and build progressive politics. But you have to play that game of going back and forth between the present and the future. And anybody who says our mind has to be only focused on the future will jam up the politics of the present. And anybody who says we have to only look at what is politically possible today is going to ignore the fact that we don't have all the time in the world. We have to keep iterating between these levels. That's the nature of the complex task that is climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you. So thank you, Navroz. Thank you, Tejal. Thank you, Chandra. Thank you, organizers. I see Raghu's here to take us home. Yes, over to you, Raghu.
Thank you so much, all our panelists, and thank you so much, attendees, both on Zoom, on YouTube. That was a supremely insightful and energetic discussion. Thank you all again.